Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and in front of us we've got all of my different composting systems. And today I'm out to feed my red wigglers. And it was a week ago that I last fed my red wigglers. That was all but two of the systems. One of the systems, which is the newest one down here, had only been launched the day prior, so it was not in the need of any food. So that one is now 8 days old. And the other system that we did not feed last time when we were down here a week ago was the oldest of the systems, which is the one that's up here. And the main reason for that was that the system was in the process of sort of starving and foraging. And the end of that process came yesterday when I finally fed that system to initiate the migration of the worms out of the finished compost. So today I'm back down here a week after feeding my red wiggler bins to feed again. But this time I am going to include the newest bin since it's been 8 days since it was launched, and it's probably due for a little bit of food as well. So that's the newest bin down here. I've also got the one down here next to it. Those have red wigglers in them, but this is that bin that has a mix of different types of worms in it. It includes European night crawlers and blue worms as well. And then the other systems that are also on the hit list today are the one that's right here above that one, as well as the one that's up here in the corner. Today's feeding can be seen here in this plastic bag. It's a variety of frozen kitchen scraps. You can see a cucumber in here. You can see some cabbage leaves, some carrots and other soup greens. I think there's a banana peel, a tomato in here. There's a whole bunch of basically common kitchen scraps that the worms are getting today. And in addition to that, there's also the coffee. So let's get these bins up on the bench and get to feeding them. There's nothing really extraordinary about today's feeding. I looked over last week's video. There wasn't really a huge amount of food added. That's why I figured today, after 7 days, it will be a good interval to come down and make sure these bins have enough food to continue. I guess another of my motivators is the amount of food scraps piling up in the kitchen. A lot of times that's one of my main triggers for wanting to come down here and get to feeding these bins. And I don't know, it's weird. I wonder why this is. I see right here the remains of a deceased worm. I just want to make sure any other sluggish worms I see on the surface are not also in that same unfortunate state. This piece of paper looks like it may have been added pretty recently. Just a piece of newspaper covering the top, sort of capturing the moisture that the plastic captures. And this coffee filter, usually the coffee filter is just an indicator of where I've last fed. Oh, here's another worm. Oops. Here's another worm that was left stuck to the plastic bag. I usually try to be careful not to bring worms out of the bin when I put all the covers aside, because I wouldn't want to have the worms crawling off and getting into trouble. The material in this bin looks pretty nice. It's definitely rich in castings, but I can also see some plentiful signs of uncomposted materials in here, all kinds of leaf stems, sticks and stems of leaves, the leafy matter of leaves. I guess this would probably be at first I thought it was a piece of paper, but it looks like it's a chunk of banana peel. Some leftover scraps from previous feedings and bedding from previous feedings. What I'm kind of after here is just looking for any sort of out of the ordinary stuff. One thing that had been seemingly plaguing my bins lately was what I thought at first to be maybe just specks of my grit, and the grit that I use is this pulverized eggshell, almost like a powder, because they look very similar, but these little tiny white specks are actually mites. And at various times I've been observing just tons and tons of these little guys in my bins. Here it looks like they're here, but maybe not in such tremendous, huge numbers that that I feel like I need to adjust anything to, you know, help reduce their numbers. I don't think there's a problem with them being in the bin. I'm just going to take a little peek on the outer edges to see how things look, and then we'll make our way into the middle, which is where the last feeding was applied. These are just various scraps of bedding, cardboard, things like that. Eventually everything really just starts to look alike. Everything just gets kind of brown and it's hard to tell things apart. But sometimes I just find myself trying to identify stuff. Here we have the stem of a banana peel. Here's a large chunk of leaf. There was a point in time not too long ago when I bought a whole bunch of large leaves in from outside. Usually when I use leaves, I have a collection of leaves that have fallen off the trees, they've dried, then I pick them up using my leaf vac. And the vac has a bagger, so it makes it really easy to collect them, and it also shreds them in the process of picking them up and running them through the vacuum. So usually my leaf scraps are really, really small, but any piece of leaf that's this large, I can almost tell for sure that this is one of the large leaves that I bought in from outside. One that had not even dried yet because it still had all of its pretty autumn colors. And that was the main reason I bought them in, was because I thought they would look really nice. Sort of decoration, autumn decoration in my worm bins. But they're just taking a little bit longer to break down than my typical leaf bedding that I put in here. The other thing that they came along with was a whole bunch of large stems. There again, my leaf vacuum, in the process of shredding everything up, breaks these leaf stems up considerably into little tiny chunks. So all of these large stems are all also part of those large whole leaves that I bought in here as decoration. And I don't think I'll do that again in the future. As cool as they all looked, they ended up taking a really long time to break down. I'm pretty sure it was a couple months ago now when I did that. And usually leaves don't take quite so long to break down, but these leaves are taking a long time to break down. And this is one of my older bins, so this is one of the bins that I might want to start steering towards completion soon. So every time I see things in the bin that are clearly large, hard objects, these stems and stuff, they're almost like sticks. It makes me wonder, how long is it going to take for all these things to finally break down? And it is going to take a little bit of time. So I just hope it doesn't take too much time, because then I'll really feel like I've, you know, kind of fouled up my own strategy of having bins that break down the material that I place in them fairly quickly. Because by placing all that type of material in here, I've definitely slowed things down considerably within the bins. This is not the only bin where I did that. But this might, hopefully it's one of the few bins where it still shows signs of it. I don't know, we'll see. We might see more of it in other bins as well. So now we're just sort of tilling up the middle area, which is where the last feeding would have been applied. And like here, for example, here's the end of another banana. It might actually be a plantain. I did feed plantains recently. Usually when it's bananas in my wormery, they're just the peels. But in this case, there were some plantains that went bad in the refrigerator, never got eaten. So they turned into worm food. So they got kind of cut up into little slices. So here too, I believe this is just a larger chunk of maybe plantain. It's eventually getting broken down, but I think we're on a couple weeks now since these things were added. This is like the stem of, I don't know, maybe a cauliflower, head of cabbage, some sort of a larger object where just the stem of it was placed in here. The smell of it implies that it's maybe a head of cabbage, the stem of a head of cabbage, because it does have a little bit of a cabbagey odor to it. You can see a whole lot of paper down here. I'm trying to remember which bin it was. It might have been this bin where I had a whole lot of this paper scattered across the top as sort of top covering. And yeah, the fact that we saw a fairly new piece of newspaper covering the top of the bin would suggest that this is the bin where I had taken all of this paper that had been covering the top surface of the bin, and I moved it down as bedding underneath the feeding, and then afterwards I replaced it with that, just a single sheet of paper across the top. So here I was attempting to finally get all of this shredded paper into play. So we've got a good abundant amount of bedding in this bin, that's for sure. I was trying to remember which of my bins I had done this to. I knew I had done it recently in one of my red wiggler bins, and it looks like this is where we had put in a whole bunch of paper as bedding underneath the feeding. So I guess we'll just put all of these old food scraps back down into the pit. And before we close up the hole, we're going to drop in today's feeding. And we'll kind of continue across. We haven't really had a chance to examine what's on this edge of the bin yet. Lately I've been following sort of a two-handful approach. So if I reach into my supply of food scraps and I pull out two good-sized handfuls like that, it's pretty consistent with what I've been placing into my bins. But every time I do that, I try to gauge relative to how much remains in the bag if I've got enough to feed all the bins I have on my to-do list today, and I believe I do. Hopefully we haven't taken too much out. Maybe we can return one or two of these things. This does look pretty plentiful and generous. Maybe not quite as much of this is required here. We want to make sure we leave enough for the other bins as well. So we have a pretty good sized piece of red cabbage here, piece of banana peel, some stuff that was in the soup, some old foods, some potato peels, piece of cucumber clearly. I don't even know what that is, maybe carrot, even some citrus peel. A couple different things thrown in here. Maybe I'll just go to the bottom of the bag and just use some of these little smaller bits and pieces floating around near the bottom. Just another piece of carrot, a few bad grapes, and I think they're grapes. Are they blueberries? Some sort of a small, dark-colored, round fruit. And, well, you know, usually I try to keep my ungloved hand clean so I could use it to handle my electronics. I broke one of my rules there. And the other thing we'll usually want to include in our feedings is the coffee. So let's here, too, use a portion, which is only a piece of what we bought down here, leaving enough for the other bins that we plan to feed today. Is this thing recording now? I had a little mishap there. It looks like my SD card filled up, but the camera didn't really tell me. So it just let me keep on going there without telling me that the filming had stopped. So we had just finished placing the food in, and then I had actually gone over to this side to see how things look, and I'll just give you a quick peek. We definitely noticed that there's a lot of worms hanging out on this side, and I believe that my working theory on why we're seeing so many worms on this side of the bin is the fact that it's this side of the bin that's facing the inside of the room. This is the side that's up against the wall where it's a little bit chillier, where some of the outside cold winter temperatures tend to come in a little bit more easily, and maybe making the bin a little bit cooler on that edge. So I just figured I'd kind of redo that quick inspection of this edge of the bin to show you how things look before we put it all away. I've also gone ahead and made some space on the SD card so that we don't get fouled up that way again. So let's get these items back in here. The feeding zone indicator showing where we last fed. And lately I've just been feeding down the middle, but we do have a brand new bin that we're going to be feeding for the first time today. I guess something we can maybe do when we get in there at the end. Since we're starting with the oldest bin, we'll make our way to the newest bin last. I don't know, maybe we'll try that pocket feeding approach and start into something a little different. and see how that works for that new bin. So let's move on to the second bin that needs to be fed today. That's this one right here. Oops. It's a it's the only one of these that's in one of the larger size tubs. All the other bins we're feeding today are in the slightly narrower container. This bin, I believe, has might be the most densely populated container that I've got. I even went in here the other day to pull worms out. It was worms from here that we had recruited to launch off that new bin that we're going to be feeding at the very end. But even after the extraction of about 1,000 worms was done, I was still kind of noticing that this bin still has a huge population in it. Now the other thing we're going to see in here is the, I don't know, it's kind of like the tilling up of the material over here in the middle. When I came in here to pull out some paper, I had taken the paper that had been covering the top here. You might have noticed that piece of paper I just removed is brand new. Besides replacing the piece of paper on here, I also kind of went through here and I rummaged through all of the loose scraps of leaves and bedding and stuff that was floating out on the top surface. And I just created sort of a little pile. Left the edge clear, but moved the whole pile kind of into the inboard area here. I thought that it was, I thought that this stuff might be of interest for the worms to come and hang out in. So I sort of stacked it all together. It's really not terribly important. If we really wanted that stuff to get a lot of attention, we could maybe even dump it down into the feeding area, because it is all like nice leafy material and paper scraps and all kinds of odds and ends, different types of bedding type materials that would make really good foundation for a feeding. But offhand, I can't remember what type of bedding situation we've got down in the feeding zone right now. If we feel like we could use a little extra bedding down there, maybe we'll just go ahead and we'll scoop all of these materials that I piled up on the two edges and dump it down in there with the food. It'll definitely give it a lot more attention by being down in there. So I think we're starting to already see some of the leftovers from the previous feeding. Something that you don't usually notice in your bins is I can smell the scent of the foods, or at least some of them. Offhand, I can't tell exactly what it is, and it might be this. I don't know if this is cabbage too. Maybe it is just cabbage. You know, cabbage has that sort of distinct pungent odor. Maybe it has a slightly, you know, stronger staying power than most of the foods you put in your bins, because most of the foods you put in your bins don't have any sort of a odor to them. You usually can't tell what it is that you're finding, but certain things do sort of carry their odor into the later stages of breakdown. And I think cabbage is just one of those types of foods that seems to have a little bit of residual smell around. So I mean, yeah, it was just, you know, Christmas. Christmas was a couple weeks ago, so cabbage is one of those traditional foods you see a lot in the Hungarian households. All kinds of cabbage dishes. So I think that's part of the reason I'm seeing so much cabbage in here. My mom contributes a fair bit of stuff to my worm feeding supplies. And I've been getting a fair bit of cabbage from her lately. I think the last couple times I bought home kitchen scraps from her place, it included good amounts of both green and red cabbage. And when you you know, when you buy cabbage, you're buying an entire head of this stuff, so you're always going to have the thick, hard stem of it within your trash or your compostable materials. So we've gone ahead and dug a nice pit right to the bottom, and other than these couple really tough objects, we didn't really find a lot of leftovers. I mean, here's another really tough object. It's a peach pit. But other than that, these worms have done a really great job breaking down the portion of food that they were given last time. So that's really neat. And I'm not really seeing many signs of any of the bedding that may have been placed in here in previous feedings. So maybe it would make good sense to scoop in some of this leafy material and paper bits that I had stacked up across the top surface of the bin. And we'll place it all down in there. Not all of it, but as much of it as I can easily pick off the edges here. Because that's going to give that stuff a lot more attention than if it just sits out on the surface. And you could tell just from looking around in this bin is really doing quite nicely. The bin we just fed is really the oldest of my bins that we're feeding today, but this one almost seems like it's further along. Maybe it's because it had such a huge worm population in it. And it still does. But up until a week or so ago, when I pulled out worms to launch off a new bin, this bin had even more worms in it than it has now. And you saw how many worms we pulled out of the feeding area as we were excavating. The worms that we found there down the middle are not even all of the worms, because a bin like this is going to have worms everywhere. So let's drop in today's feeding. Now I'm going to just use my soiled glove, I think, to try to keep my clean hand clean, just in case I have more technical issues to contend with. We're going to go with another couple handfuls, trying to leave sufficient food for the other two bins that we're feeding next. Kind of 2 handfuls of large chunks and then the final handful of little tiny scraps from the bottom of the bag. Just looking at what remains, and I think that's a good portion to keep for the last 2 bins that we're feeding. Although I don't think those other 2 bins are quite as densely populated as this bin. So maybe a couple more little scraps like that'll probably be a good idea. Because it does seem like they're doing away quite nicely with whatever food we give them. Let's also give them some coffee. Try to save a little bit for the other 2 bins we're going to feed. And then we could proceed with getting things covered up. I did hint at how I suspect things look on the outer edges of this bin. Oh, let's get these food items down where they belong. So we can take a peek in there too before we close up shop here. Just every time I find something, here's another peach pit. Try to get that down into the feeding area too. Recently I just put in some peach pits and some plum pits to see how they go. So my bins are going to be probably composting peach pits and plum pits for a while, because I think that those types of items are going to take a little bit of time to break down. So I don't think we looked out here on these outer edges. Here too, this would be the edge of the bin that is up against the wall, where it might be a little bit chillier and maybe a little bit less hospitable for the worms if they favor a warmer spot to be. The material looks really nice out there, but we definitely didn't see a whole lot of worms. This is another sort of hard substance. I don't know what it is. Not a peach pit. I believe this might actually be a part of an avocado seed. We'll get that down in the middle too. So it was a little surprising to see so little action out on that edge. Let's take a peek over on this side and see what we see. Huh. Here too, kind of quiet out on the outer edges. So maybe the feeding zone is the party spot in this bin. Just a little different from what we saw in the previous bin, where we saw quite a number of worms out on the edge of the bin, as opposed to what we're seeing here in this bin. Oops. Okay. So yeah, things look really nice in this fairly densely populated bin. And, you know, if I don't forget, we'll get back to using these feeding zone indicators. Why not, right? just in case we start switching things up. It will help me to remember where the feeding zone is, especially if for the last bin we feed deviates from what the norm has been lately in my wormery. The norm being center feedings. But if we do start coming up with different feeding patterns, it'll help me to know where the last feeding was, so we can focus our attention there to see how things are progressing with previous feedings. All right, moving on. All right, so this is that container that's got the assortment of different worm types in it. Not only red wigglers, probably predominantly red wigglers, but also what's thought to be a mix of also European night crawlers and blue worms. I'm pretty sure we got all the worms off the plastic. Although this is once again a weird thing. Every now and then I see weird things in my bins, and I think this is just like a piece of a worm. What the heck? I don't know. Is that what we're seeing right there? Another piece of a dead worm? All right, hopefully we don't see too much more of that sort of stuff. A little bit sluggish, but it's alive. This worm has like an unusual sort of kink in it. Doesn't look very active. It is alive and it's moving, but right down there, look at that, it just tore in half from me touching it. I wonder what is going on here. It's almost like they're just dissolving down the middle. Here too, why is this worm so short? It just seems out of proportion somehow. All right, hopefully we don't have some sort of an issue happening here. I feel like this piece of paper, which was sort of a top covering, is just not going to be usable for that purpose anymore. It's just too far gone. Way too tattered. So I'm just going to set it aside, and we'll do the same with that as we did in the other bin with the stuff we collected off the top. We'll just sink it down under the feeding. And then I'll go ahead and I'll find another piece of paper we can place across the top to cover things up. As we make our way from oldest bin to newest bin, we're going to start seeing a little bit of a trend here. We're going to see more and more paper scraps and leaf scraps and large chunks of the materials that were used to originally build the bin. But, you know, over time, all these worm castings start to get intermingled with that stuff, and the worms continue breaking all that other stuff down. And it'll all just be worm castings in the end. Because not only are they eating the food that we're giving them, they're eating everything else too. They're eating all that bedding, breaking it all down. So out here on the edge, I guess the only thing I'm noticing here is that things seem a little bit clumped together for some reason. I don't know why. So every time I find a somewhat clumped together chunk of material, I'll see if I could break it up. Like in this case, it's just a few pieces of paper matted together or crumbled together. We'll see if we can kind of mingle it together with all this loose stuff that surrounds it, so we don't have like big hard chunks of things. I'm going to try to keep things nice and loose and fluffy, well aerated, and easy to access from all directions. You don't want to have like big mounds of stuff that the worms can't get to the center of. Alright, so for whatever reason we were starting to find a little clumping happening over on this side. We've more or less remedied that by breaking things apart nicely there. And I guess we'll move some of this material that we scooped off the top over to this side, since we're more or less done over here. And we'll save that to be part of our feeding. Let's see how things look on this edge of the bin. Once again, this is the side of the bin that's facing the inside of the room, so it should be a little bit warmer. This has the appearance of plastic almost, but I don't think it is plastic. Could I have been so careless to drop such a large chunk of plastic into my bin, or could this just be the outer skin of something that they were fed? Because they're really good at picking off the, maybe for example if this was an apple, they're very good at picking off the compostable portion of it. But a lot of apples have a really thin coating of wax applied to them, as do some other vegetables and fruits. I'm just wondering if that might be that thin coating of material. I mean, it breaks apart pretty readily, but I'm really reluctant to just throw it back in the bin because it just doesn't seem natural. So you know what, I'm going to toss this in the trash. This here too, this looks like a chunk of plastic. Let me get rid of that. The worms that inhabit this bin are from a different source. So usually I build my bins with worms that I sourced from my own environment, out of my own population. But in this case, I built this bin and then the worms were sent to me. So when the worms were released into this container, they were occupying some material and they were introduced into this bin together with all that material that they were occupying. And I can't really account for everything. I mean, worms are worms, but whatever that material is that they were occupying, I'm not sure what that was exactly. So who knows, some stuff could have snuck in there along with the worms that I'll have to fish out over time if it's not really compostable materials. Over on this edge, I don't feel like I'm finding as many large chunks that need to be broken apart because they're clumping. Things seem a little bit more loose over on this side. Here too, it looks like we've had some sort of a seed that started growing here. Every time a seed starts growing in my bins, I just sort of snap it in half and it turns into worm food. I think here too we're seeing a couple little sprouts of stuff popping out. No big deal. Sometimes it does seem a little annoying when you get a lot of it happening, but it's really no big deal at all. Okay, now we're starting to get towards the middle, which is where the feedings have been getting applied. And I already felt something that seemed like it was one of the old portions of food that they'd been given previously. So like this here would be a half of a avocado, which is usually a pretty popular spot. I don't know, it's weird. I'm seeing all kinds of little sprouts growing in here. I'm not sure why. Not sure what's growing or what's attempting to grow. The avocado is looking pretty popular in here. Got a couple worms hanging out, taking advantage of the yummy food. I'm seeing little white specks here too, but I'm never certain if I'm seeing traces of the grit that I apply or if it's actually maybe little white mites here too. It's really hard to tell unless you just really patiently watch and then you start seeing them move and then you know they're mites. Or sometimes on the video, if I play it back quickly, I could tell. This is part of the avocado. It's the avocado's pit. And then there's some other things in here. This would be part of the plantain that had been cut up into little sections. So the peel of it is around the outside. And the worms are in there eating away the meaty part of the plantain. It's funny because some of the bins that I've got that plantain in don't seem to be as interested in the material as in here. Here it looks like the worms are definitely digging the plantain. And then as we work our way down, we've got good mobs of worms hanging out down here, doing who knows what. Checking out maybe some of this paper bedding. What else? More mobs of worms. Seeming to really enjoy the bedding. This bin does have a new type of worm that, or at least new type of worm for me, a type of worm that I've not had in my bins before, the blue worms. People have been telling me about different characteristics of their behavior, and one of them is how they tend to really mob together the same way red wigglers do. And I think that's probably what we're observing here, whether this is red wigglers or blue worms kind of piling on over here. It's one of the fun things of having a worm bin, is encountering some sort of delicious food item that the worms are really drawn to, and then seeing them all kind of piling on. The other thing I'm doing here, as you could tell, is I'm taking paper bits, pieces of bedding type material as I encounter them, and placing them there as opposed to the food chunks that I encounter that I'm placing over here. There's certainly no need to be this particular when going through your worm bin. I'm just the curious type, and especially in a bin like this where I'm just still trying to get accustomed to the behavior of a new type of worm that I've not yet had in my wormery. I'm just using this as an opportunity to get a better look at how the blue worms behave, although in this case it's very difficult to tell, which is a blue worm, which is a red wiggler, for that matter, which is a night crawler. I think people have mentioned how the really fast worms are the blue worms, and what I'm definitely observing here is some super fast movement, perhaps a little faster than I'm accustomed to seeing. So perhaps what we're seeing here is predominantly blue worm action, but it's really tough to tell, and I'm definitely no expert when it comes to distinguishing one type of worm from the other. Wow, look at that. Even on this side we've got quite a huge number of worms hanging out, and a tremendous amount of castings piling up too. This is a fairly young bin. I think that was the other thing that people had made reference to, was the way the blue worms are just voracious. They just pile, they pile on the food, they plow through it, they break it down 1, 2, 3. So I think I'm starting to understand why people were telling me that I'm going to really enjoy having these types of worms in the wormery, because they do seem pretty active and pretty efficient at breaking things down, and they're fun to see when they mound together into large piles. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so we've got a whole collection of stuff over here that we can use as sort of a platform to dump all the fresh food on, which is something I like to do, because as the food starts to break down, it starts to emit all of its juices as it thaws, because all my food is usually frozen. I like having sort of a bedding type material right below the feeding area that all those juices and sugars and all that good nourishing stuff can drip into, because then you no longer have just boring bland chunks of paper and leaves down there. You've got all kinds of stuff that's soaked with nourishing stuff that the worms can really make use of. So even though they might plow through all of the food scraps that you've given them, they'll be left with a whole bunch of bedding materials that are also soaked with all kinds of nourishing materials. So this is definitely a fun bin to check in on. Kind of like the last bin that we just checked in on. Fun because it's really crowded, and this bin's pretty crowded too. A little bit more crowded than I thought it was. So I'm gonna give this one the 2-handful treatment as well, although I think one thing we've been doing is sort of dipping back into here and almost grabbing one last little handful to complement what we've given them. And I think what I've got left is approximately the same as what all the other bins got, so it's a good portion and a good distribution of the food that I've been trying to divvy up equally between the bins. Let's throw in a little bit of grit, a little bit of coffee. Trying to leave a little bit for the last bin that we're going to feed, which is the newest bin, which is only 8 days old. And I'm curious to see how it's coming along, because I've not yet had a chance to peek in there to see how it's progressing. I basically launched off that bin 8 days ago and have left it alone, untouched, for all that time. I've had no reason to think that there's anything other than good stuff happening in there, so hopefully we're not in for any surprises over there. And this bin, yeah, I definitely like what I'm seeing in this bin. I got a feeling that this bin is definitely going to be one of my more productive bins. So let's let's treat this bin to a nice, fresh, new feeding zone indicator. But I'd also like to cover up here with a piece of paper. Oops. The paper, it's really only there to, I think, serve as sort of a platform for the moisture to drop onto after it tries to evaporate out of the bin and gets collected by the plastic coverings here on top. And then the worms really like to come over there and have a nice supply of moisture to dip into if they need it. And it's also just fun to have a little bit of a worm welcoming party when you open up a bin to feed it. So we're on our way to the newest of the bins and the last bin to be fed today. So let's get that one out here. Now this, wow, it's so light compared to all the other bins. I could just pick it up with one hand if I wanted to. So the construction of this bin is probably consistent with what you've been seeing in most of my bins, which is a covering over the plastic, mainly meant to provide a dark space under it. Because since the plastic is more or less see-through, I'd rather have just darkness there 24 hours a day as opposed to daylight hours when it might just be a little bit too bright for the worms, or might end up having worms not come up there or leave there because of the brightness. And then here's that traditional piece of paper on top that I like to have the moisture collect on. In the very new bins, it seems like the worms just, haven't sort of realized what's going on here quite yet. So here we could see almost little puddles and a huge amount of moisture, a lot more than we see in most of my bins, because I think that the worms just haven't really stumbled on it yet. But if there were worms coming up here to hang out on this, they would have probably sipped up all of these little water droplets and little puddles of water by now. But this bin's only a few days old, and for whatever reason in these newer bins the worms just don't seem to realize what's going on quite yet. But in time they will, and there'll be worms hanging out all over that piece of paper. But for now it's still somewhat barren of any worm activity. I don't see any worms up here either. We launched what I estimated to be about 1,000 worms, and I do see one, the tail of one worm right there. So at least we got one worm here welcoming us to the party. And since there's been no feedings, it makes sense that there's no feeding zone indicator, but I did grab one that we're going to apply after we drop the food in, so that's right there as well. So here, I think what I'm really going to expect to find is lots of leaves, almost whole. Although, here too, it's almost a whole leaf, right? And these are out of my leaf collection bags that I place all of my leaves in that get collected with the leaf bagger, leaf grinder. So some leaves just slide through and don't get shredded. But a great many do, and I do end up with lots of, little tiny bits of leafy material, which is what I prefer. I wish these sticks would get broken up a little bit better. But these sticks also, I try to see the bright side of things. I end up using these sticks as sort of an indicator to tell me how far along a bin is. Because if these sticks have all been broken down and I don't see any signs of this in one of my older bins, then chances are everything else that was in the bin has probably already broken down as well. In here, in my newer bins, when I build a bin, I scatter the food supply all over the place. So it wouldn't be like you normally see in most of my bins where there's just a concentrated mass of worms in any one given place, because the food is not in any one given place. The food's just scattered all over the place, so it's not too surprising for us to just kind of rummage around a little bit and find a few worms here, a few worms there, but I don't know if we're going to find a large mass of worms. That is, unless we encounter a piece of larger chunk of food that may have been placed in here and is still kind of being worked on. So here might be an example of that. Here's I think it's just another chunk of plantain or banana or something like that. And I'm seeing a little bit of worm activity in it. I can see some worms nestled within it, ripping away at the fleshy portion of the fruit, but not too many. The other thing I'm noticing is how the leafy material is a little bit drier than it needs to be, but it's not terrible. I tend to subscribe to the belief that by having the plastic covering on top and by not allowing the moisture to leave through evaporation, that in time all the materials in the bin will sort of equalize in moisture. But it is unusual how certain little pockets of materials do tend to remain somewhat dry. So my hope is that we're not creating an environment that's really hostile to the worms over here. I mean, it is a little bit damp here and there, especially around where the food items are that we stumbled on while we were, picking through here. This also seems like maybe a chunk of food because there is a good amount of moisture around it, or maybe what remains of where there had been some food. Here too, you can see some of the stuff that I use in the build of my bins. I always take these tubes and I chop them into little rings to build my bins. So it always seems like no matter how it's laying down, it's always going to have little air pockets in and around it because of its shape and its structure. I think it allows for nice airflow and good structure within the bin. So down the middle area here too, I'm sure we're going to encounter chunks of food that were placed in here as part of the bin. The bin's build here too is the end of a plantain, I believe. Somehow it just doesn't have that look like it's a banana. Here in the middle, this is where I guess we're going to start seeing a little bit more action. Probably because it does seem like it's the spot where there's the greatest amount of moisture. Right away I'm seeing a good bit of moisture down the middle, and all the worms are kind of hanging out around it. Again, I don't know if it's just moisture that's resulting from the breakdown of the food that was in there, or maybe there's just moisture in the middle because it's the most sheltered from the potential of evaporation. You saw the plastic that was covering things here. It was fairly thoroughly covering things from edge to edge. I'm starting to wonder if we might benefit from giving this container a little bit of a spray down. I am trying to mix a lot of the more dry stuff with the somewhat more damp stuff here too. We're on this side of the bin that was facing inwards, so maybe that's part of the reason we're finding more worms over here, either because of the slightly warmer temperatures or maybe because of some sort of a food item that was here, which I'm not really seeing many signs of. Here too, a little bit more worm action right down here at the bottom. Maybe also resulting from a piece of food that was in here. Here too, it seems like a piece of banana or plantain, attracting the attention of all the worms. But I'm almost wondering if it is the warmth that's causing the worms to want to be over on that side of the bin. Just because of the way the bin is oriented up against the wall, with the cooler side being over here that's facing the wall. I think I smell little traces of the food that the bin was originally built with. I think I smell the plantain a little bit, but hardly. The only thing I'm thinking here is that it might make good sense to give this bin a little injection of moisture. So something that you don't really see me do very often because I just don't have to, because of the plastic coverings that I use, which keep the moisture in the bin. But on a new bin like this, where it's a little bit difficult to tell in the very beginning whether the materials that you included in the build of the bin are adequately dampened, I'm just going to come in here and give everything, at least on the top surface here, a little bit of a spray down, just to inject a little bit of extra moisture. And the other thing that's going to add moisture is the food that we're adding. All of that stuff, as it starts to thaw out, it too will emit moisture into the bin, making things a little bit more hospitable. The worms can certainly focus, around those food scraps to get the moisture that they need if they're finding that they're deficient in moisture. This looks like, the way it crumbles, it might have been bread or something that I had used. So just all moldy. But this is pretty much normal for a brand new worm bin that's only about a week old. It's mainly bedding. Here and there you're going to see early signs of some of the casting materials that they're producing, but chances are if you do see casting materials, it could just be the casting that came over with the worms when they were loaded into here. Because when I, when I bought them over, they would have been nested within some of the material that they were inhabiting when I fetched them out of the bin that they had been in. And a lot of the material that they might have been inhabiting would have been just castings. So I don't want to get too psyched up when I see castings developing in one of my younger bins. A lot of times I'll just assume that it's casting material that came over with the worms when they were loaded into the bin. But the casting accumulation will increase, obviously, over time. And I don't know if the population in this bin is all that much. I estimated 1,000 worms, but it might even be shy of that. It might not even be a full 1,000 worms. So I believe I will probably be adding more worms to this bin going forward. Depends, we'll see. I've been thinking about maybe, starting bins with fewer worms and just letting them build out their populations on their own to occupy the space that they're given. It'll result in somewhat slower breakdown of the materials, but I believe the other end result of taking that approach would be an increase in the overall population of my worms, which is kind of something I'm interested in doing at this point. I don't know. It seems like it would be kind of nice to have more worm bins, more worms, more room to compost stuff. I always feel like I'm just running out of space in my refrigerator. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I'm always feeling like I'm getting crowded, out of space in my freezer. So I'm going to attempt to simply drop in all the rest of the food that I bought down here. I wonder how much we ended up with here. It doesn't seem like it's all that much, and it probably doesn't matter because we saw some leftover scraps of the initial build of the bin, and it doesn't seem like a terribly highly populated bin either. So I don't think we need to go too crazy worrying about the food supply in this bin, especially since all the bedding materials in the bin are all food as well. The one thing I definitely want to include, though, as you know, when it comes to the newer bins of mine, just want to make sure they got grit. Make sure they've got enough grit to break down the food that they have. So looks like I've tapped out this container of grit, but I've got more where that came from. I made a whole bunch last time, and even since then I've accumulated a whole bunch of eggshells too. So we've done a great job depleting all of the stuff I came down here with. At first I felt like I might have come down here with a little bit too much stuff, but I believe it was actually just the right amount. None of the bins really received what I would consider to be a glut of food. Every bin seemed to receive just a good, maybe 2.5 to 3 handfuls of food. Probably closer to 2 handfuls. And that's generally the portion that I find to be sufficient to keep the bin busy for about a week or so. Usually I'll come back and find leftovers of that last feeding. But that's fine, I'll usually feed anyway. So I just want to make sure that there's a good steady supply of food in all my worm bins. So I'm going to see if I could use this coffee filter. Here is a little bit of a paper towel to clean off my glove. It'd be a shame to wash all of this good bedding material down into the drain if it could just be returned to the bin, right? And then we're going to use this coffee filter as an indicator to show us where we last fed. And I know I had mentioned possibly pocket feeding, maybe shifting the location of where we feed from location to location. I kind of didn't pay too much attention, and I just reverted back to my standard method of feeding, which is to just place the food right down the middle, which is kind of my standard approach nowadays. But maybe if I remember next time, maybe we'll transition to sort of a pocket feeding approach, which is kind of cool too, because it kind of causes the worms to move from location to location. Then you can really actually look back onto previous feeding spots to see how those previous feedings are in fact breaking down. So I don't see a problem with doing that if I remember to do so. So we'll see how that goes. All right, let's get things covered up here because we're done. The red wigglers are now all fed. And things in all of my red wiggler bins are fairly consistent. The only thing being different, obviously, is the state in which each bin is relative to its age. Each bin is seeming to be good, or pretty good from a moisture perspective. I think things in this bin can probably be slightly improved with a little bit more moisture. So hopefully that little bit of squirting of water that I did there helps things. And if need be, we'll do the same next time, but hopefully things by that time will be a little bit more damp and cozy for the worms. All the other bins are looking good too. We saw some mites, not a big deal. I think it's not as severe as we've seen in other places in the past. So I like the way things are looking in my red wiggler bins. I don't know, 4 bins. Hopefully we didn't make too much of a long video. Hopefully I haven't lost you. Okay, everyone, if you're still there, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, and I sure hope you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also please consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.